What's up, everybody? Welcome to this episode of Facts on the Ground. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Misty Winston. And today we have as our guest, Dr. Daniel Yegic. He is a researcher, he's a writer, and he's done a lot of good work on the Qana massacres in Lebanon, which there have been two actually, almost 10 years apart, exactly 1996 and 2006. And the anniversary of the 1996 massacre is coming up on April 18th. And we're going to talk about that today, the legacy of that, and then also the 2006 repeat of that, and why it's still important. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's start with the 1996 massacre and what exactly happened there, because it seems to be long forgotten in history. But when you read about what happened there, it's a horrendous
Mhm.
occurrence and should be known by more people. But
Mhm.
can you give us a little background there?
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. Should be known by more people, and it's been an event that had caused some international reactions, and it was a news story for a while in international and English language media. However, it disappeared quickly from the headlines, like many other atrocities that were taking place in Lebanon. Now, the Qana massacre from '96, of course, has to be seen in the broader context of the illegal Israeli occupation. Um, so Israel had occupied Lebanon or part of southern Lebanon until the year 2000. And the massacre was unfortunately one of many atrocities that the Israeli regime had committed in Lebanon. It did catch attention in particular because it was a UN compound that was attacked by Israeli army, and there were journalists on the ground who had covered the story. So as far as I know, over I think 800 people had sought shelter in that area and were affected, and over 100 were killed. More than half of them were children. Um, and so, as I said, was not an isolated incident. It is an example of what Israel has been or had been doing in Lebanon for so many decades. What was particular about it is that it did enter headlines, international media, and Israel did have to explain. So they were changing the narrative several times and eventually claiming that this happened by mistake, that they were not aware of the presence of these people there. But then also it did cause attention because it was a UN compound that was attacked. It was not only, the victims were not only people from Lebanon, but there were also, I think, four UN workers who were killed in these attacks. And yeah, I guess that's a brief summary of what happened in April 1996.
So they called it Operation Grapes of Wrath, and it really kind of started on April 11th, and it was like these continued attacks. And you mentioned that they very much tried to not take any blame, and we're trying to very much control the narrative as they do now. But something that I found interesting is that they claimed, oh well, we gave them 24 hours. They were supposed to evacuate. We told these 44 towns and villages that they needed to evacuate. But what they don't mention in that storyline is that they were also attacking the roads leading out. So a lot of people were afraid to even leave, their towns because, either you're going to get it coming or going. So we still see Israel doing those sorts of things now. How many people were killed in this attack specifically, did you say?
I think it was 106 that were killed, and I think it was more than half of them were children.
Yeah, and a lot of these were families who were just terrified to leave because either way, they were either going to stay and potentially get slaughtered, or if they leave, they could also get slaughtered on the streets. So I think that that's an important thing that people need to recognize, that when you're looking at this, a lot of the times you'll see that Israel tried to claim that, oh, we told them to evacuate. They were warned, but they don't mention that they were also attacking the roads. on the way out. So it
Absolutely.
really left these people with very little choice,
Mhm.
very little options to protect their families.
Right. And when we're talking about the carnage at the first massacre, uh, Robert Fisk does a really good job of detailing it in his book, Pity the Nation. But we're talking about babies who had their heads sliced off by shrapnel and other artillery remnants, and it was a massacre. We hear that term so often
Mhm.
in the media to describe um, events that have happened, but this really was a massacre of over
Mhm.
100 people. And yeah, Israel did have to explain itself, but do you think it got away with it in a sense?
I do think it did, because it was one of the maybe few occasions where it was supposed to explain itself. It was committing all sorts of crimes for decades in Lebanon. I mean, if we want to go back, it was in 1948 when the first massacre was committed in South Lebanon, where the first Lebanese village was set on fire by the Israeli army. So it's been 73 years of constant staged terrorism. And it was only a couple of occasions when there wasn't maybe an international outcry or reaction. And I do think that it got away with it because even the news coverage on the Kana massacre was focusing on the victims on that particular event. But oftentimes the broader context of the Israeli occupation, why was there an Israeli army in the first place? What do they have to do in Lebanon, which was in violation of several UN resolutions and a violation of international law, which is a structural violation that Israel has been committing for the past decades. So I do think it got away with it, and it did get support from the United States, which had even back then said that they support the Israeli narrative. And effectively, I mean, we see, if we want to go back to 82, there was the Sabra and Shatila massacre, for example, that was even by the United Nations in a resolution condemned as a genocide. And even here, although it was on the front page of Time magazine, there was in the New York Times. I've just recently done some research on that and went through some of the archives of media outlets from 82. It did initiate reactions, but even there, this was something that was referred to as a genocide, and even then in the media, it might be a massacre and might be seen as one event, but the structures that are so violent are oftentimes obscured, and that happens in favor of the Israeli regime.
Yeah. So maybe we can provide a little context with the Lebanese civil war and with Israel's two invasions, I believe, during that war. The second of which I think they were still in Lebanon in 96 when the first Kana massacre happened. But ostensibly they got involved because of the PLO presence in Lebanon. And, from there it became, what Israel usually does. And 17,000 plus people died after the Israeli occupation. And then they were there, like you said, up until 2000, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So can we just talk about a little history there about
Mm-hmm.
the first and second Israeli invasions and occupations and what they said they were doing and what they were actually doing, and also
Mm-hmm.
the Sabra and Shatila massacres, because I think
Mm-hmm.
it provides sort of like a step up to
Mm-hmm.
the Kana massacre and then the later Kana massacre that we'll get to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, the Lebanese Civil War broke out in 1775, but by that time, I mean, if we just go back again to 48, it was the very violent proclamation of the State of Israel that put Lebanon and the newly founded State of Israel in a state of war. So they've been in a state of war for 73 years now. But even before the Lebanese civil war started, there were several Israeli attacks on Lebanon and raids, including now, I can't recall the exact year, but there was, for example, a raid on the airport in Beirut that was largely destroyed several years before the civil war, without any justification other than, of course, Israel trying to seize the refugee crisis that it had created when it expelled the vast majority of the Palestinian population from their indigenous land in 48, and many of which went to Lebanon. So there were practices of resistance against the Israeli regime from within Lebanon and other surrounding countries. When the Lebanese civil war started, of course, Israel sought to divide and conquer. That was basically, to put it short, what they were trying to do. So looking for allies within Lebanon that where they might have ideological intersections and that could help them achieve their goals. So that was, and the large scale invasion happened in 82. So throughout the summer of 82, Beirut became the second Arab capital after Jerusalem to be under Israeli occupation, and tens of thousands of civilians were killed. And Israel aligned itself with certain primarily Christian right-wing, far-right forces that also shared anti-Palestinian ideologies or had ideological intersections with the Zionist regime. So
the Phalange in particular, right?
Exactly, right. So they were in 82, basically there were several incidents that took place that led to an escalation in the conflict between the far-right Christians and Palestinians. And then while Israel was in Beirut and occupying Beirut, which it also did under the pretext to a certain extent of what they claimed to intervene from a peaceful perspective, which is oftentimes what the Israeli regime claims to do. So they were entering the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp, which are basically two refugee camps that are in the south of Beirut, with Palestinian refugees who had escaped 48 in the year 48 from Palestine. And so basically massacre took place over 3 days. Thousands of people were massacred, killed in the most brutal ways. And even there were journalists who eventually entered the camps and talked about how it just smelled like death. And yeah, this massacre was considered, even I'm using the word massacre now, but we can refer to it as a genocide. So yeah, and then basically when we go to 96, so that was almost half a century since the establishment of Israel. So there was a lot of violence that had taken place before, and the people in the South had lived under a very brutal reality under the Israeli army for a whole generation by the time the Qana massacre, the first one, had taken place.
And I think it's interesting too that the reason why Israel was forced to explain themselves is basically essentially due to a whistleblower. There was video footage of the unmanned drone in the airspace. Israel denied the existence of said drone until video evidence was made available to Robert Fisk. And then it was they were no longer able to deny that there was a drone in the airspace monitoring the area. It seems though that it doesn't really matter what Israel does.
Right.
They always get away with it. They seem to be very protected. And even when we have video evidence, nothing happens. It's very, I'm a big Assange supporter and activist, and it's very similar to like the collateral murder video for me. It's evidence of a war crime and nothing happens. So can you talk a little bit about the fact that there was both a whistleblower and then also the on the ground eyewitnesses who were testifying that the fact that there was an unmanned drone monitoring the area at the time?
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, Robert Fisk wrote about it, and it was another incident that caused headlines, and it was people were able to see there was video, audio, material evidence of Israeli crimes, but even that it it's similar to in 2006, right? There was even more evidence. It was very well documented what Israel was doing in 2006, and it never really had to explain itself because effectively this narrative that Israel has been using seems to be so much stronger because it plays on these Orientalist tropes that have been there for so many centuries. And it has always already in advance created the victims as legitimate targets, as terrorists. So regardless of what crimes it had been committing for the past 73 years, there is a maximum, maybe a voicing of concern from, not even from the international community, because effectively there is the Israeli narrative that is about defending itself, that constructs those binaries between civilizations, that indigenous people, including babies who were killed in these massacres, are part of a terrorist infrastructure. That, I mean, churches, mosques, hospitals, all of these parts of the civilian infrastructure that have been destroyed in and beyond Ghana are effectively presented as a terrorist infrastructure. So regardless of how much the evidence there was so far, including investigations, and it is effectively this narrative that is so strong. And then also Israel is very cleverly reinventing its narrative to fit whatever is currently maybe a strong justification. So if we look back at its first invasions of Lebanon, it was the PLO that they were constructing as the main enemy. Now today it's Hezbollah, it's Iran. In 2001, when the so-called war on terror was started, it was when the Intifada was taking place, the second Intifada in Palestine, and then the war on terror was used as a justification to silence Palestinian protesters and put them in jail collectively. And it seems that these narratives and this very simple and racist rhetoric is oftentimes much stronger than any evidence of actual war crimes and atrocities.
Why do you think we know the Israeli excuse that they're supposedly combating terror when they've invaded Lebanon, or with what they're doing to people in Gaza and the West Bank. But what do you think their real aims are? Because just fast forwarding to 2006, I remember reading that part of Zionist philosophy is that all of Israel's borders must be water borders, for example, like the Mediterranean. And so people were speculating that part of what they were doing in 2006 was trying to push north to the Litani River in Lebanon to make that their northern border. I mean, before we get too much into 2006, can you talk about that aspect of sort of like the Zionist military push for land? Because I think there's an aspect of that to what Israel's done.
Absolutely. This is very central to the Zionist ideology. And so in fact, Israel never declared its borders. It does not really have borders. And we see this flexibility of expanding borders with the case with, where Israel doesn't really define where it begins, where it ends in regard to the Palestinian territories that it has occupied. So even though this is an occupied territory under international law, when it suits Israel, it considers all of Palestine as part of Israel. And when it doesn't suit it, it considers it as foreign enemy territory, but there are no actual borders. And if we look into Zionist ideology, of course, the initial Zionism is a settler colonial project. And I think this is very essential and is not part of many of these mainstream discussions that we have in the English-speaking world on Palestine, on Israel, on Lebanon, on the whole region, because this is a settler colonial movement that depends on expansionism and on expanding its settlements, which effectively means that the indigenous people, which in this case are Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, stand in the way of the colonizers. So they effectively become a threat and they become an obstacle that needs to be eliminated in some way, because effectively settler colonialism is genocidal in its core. And we see that very well with, of course, the Israeli military as an institution that is highly indoctrinated, and it has is holding all of Palestine, parts of Syria under military control, and has tried repeatedly to expand into Lebanon. Even right now, I mean, there are invasions on a daily basis. There are Israeli warplanes above Lebanon on a daily basis, which is something you can hear them sometimes more, sometimes less, but there are effectively hundreds of Israeli invasions of Lebanese territory per year. I think the last number I had was last year. Between January and May, I think it was 1,000. There was a complaint by Lebanon at the UN. So there is this constant spread of terror, of intimidation, far beyond Palestine. Whereas if we look into the Western, I don't want to generalize Western, but let's say into the English-speaking media and the narratives that we have there in Israel, like even among leftists or among more progressive voices, there might be a debate on the occupation or how illegal it is. But the fact that Israeli crimes or Israeli goals and the whole settler colonial movement doesn't stop in Palestine, but it's a transnational endeavor, is also really addressed, I think. And I guess Lebanon and the military expansion of Israel into Lebanon is one of maybe the best example of it.
Yeah, and we should be clear too that when these flyovers happen that you mentioned, they're purposely creating sonic booms to intimidate the population below.
It's terrorism.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's really what it boils down to. And you're right, though. It is really something that doesn't get discussed in the Western world at all, really. But in particular, just being an American, it's been really disheartening for me to see, quote unquote, progressives or leftists sort of surrender foreign policy. And, they don't discuss imperialism or any of those things at all. They don't. I mean, you're right. Israel is very settler colonialism. That's exactly what it is. But it isn't discussed. Nobody will. I mean, you even have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's supposed to be like the big progressive right now, pandering to AIPAC and Israel constantly, despite the fact that she ran on Palestinian rights. Is that something that you are surprised by at all? Or is this something that, we've kind of been seeing it coming for a while. I mean, Israel's done a very good job at sort of controlling United States government officials for a while now. But is this something that surprises you, that so-called progressives or leftists in the West are ignoring this issue?
I don't find it surprising at all. And I wouldn't have expected anything else, to be honest, because I find it even worse sometimes with so-called progressives, because, as you mentioned, they do mention Palestinian rights, as she did when in her electoral campaign back then, as far as I remember, and then effectively just pretend as if Palestinians don't exist. And I think in some ways that might make it even worse than having someone who is an actual Zionist and is very open about it. It just might create false hopes. But I'm not surprised by it at all, because effectively the relationship between the United States and Israel is one. Israel works as a U.S. proxy in many ways in this region. So there is, of course, the lobby, there's AIPAC, but there's also some sort of identity that, or maybe a dimension that Israel has for U.S. political identity. Or for the identity or identification of the United States as a strong country in the world. And I think departing from that and proclaiming support for Palestinian rights would have people pay a price that is probably too much for someone who is a career politician or would like to get reelected, I think. So I don't think it's surprising at all, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's unbelievable in the States. I'm sure you're aware, but if you make any criticism of Israel as a politician, your career's pretty much over. And that speaks to the reach of the Israel lobby, and especially AIPAC, which is the biggest lobbyist. Um, how do you how would you say that entities like AIPAC and uh, maybe media outlets like J Street, for example, do you think they've played a large part in propagandizing what's happened in Ghana, and also Greater Lebanon, with regard to these wars and these crimes?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a bigger other institutions that are perpetuating this narrative, and this really settler colonial narrative of dehumanizing the victims. And it's a very simple structure. And I've seen so many examples of, I mean, there's also the what's called the Anti-Defamation League, that would also play into these tropes. And I feel like, through repetition, it just becomes maybe culturally standardized to an extent. And the same with the media. I don't necessarily think that that there is always an anti-Palestinian or an aggressively anti-Palestinian bias as much as there is repetition and copy pasting and language. I think language plays a very important role, maybe much more than we're aware of, especially, even with terms like, when we talk about Palestinians, and Lebanon, there is conflict, two-state solution, negotiations. There's no two-state solution. There never was any. There are no negotiations. Terrorism, right? The only terrorism that there is the Israeli state terrorism. But
or disputed territories,
right.
instead of occupied. Instead of occupied, yeah.
Exactly, or the occupation itself, which is not even the source of the problem. It's something that started in 67, like almost a whole century after Zionism emerged. And even that occupation becomes a term that's sometimes taboo. So I think language plays an important role, and things become culturally standardized that there must not always, doesn't really have to be an intentionally anti-Palestinian agenda in order for people to accept these narratives.
I think that's such an important point. We talk about that a lot on the show. Language is really crucial in so many things. And, I think my friend Steve says all the time that the United States is the most propagandized planet, or the most propagandized country on the planet. And he's absolutely right. It's not as, in your face as maybe like in a North Korea, but it's very, very, very pervasive. It surrounds you every day. It's in the commercials you watch on TV. It's in the newspaper. It's when you go to any airport or even get, your oil changed in your car. CNN or Fox News or MSNBC is plastered all over the TVs. And that is essentially state-run propaganda. It's corporate owned, and corporations very clearly own our government. So it really is all hand in hand. And they're very good at what they do. They're very good at, presenting a narrative that, isn't in your face, overtly giving you received opinions, but that's exactly what it's doing. And you're right, it's through repetition. That's why they only cover the same 4 or 5 stories over and over and over again, because they know if they repeat it, it becomes truth. And that's become really dangerous in this country. And we don't get to see, like you said, we don't hear about these things. We don't hear about the Ghana massacre. We don't hear about the crimes that Israel is committing in not just Gaza. We don't even hear about that. We don't hear about the crimes against Palestinians as much as we should, but we don't hear about any of the other things that they're doing. So yeah, I think that, language and the propaganda is a huge and important piece in this, for sure. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
Should we move on to 2006 though? Because I think that that's, a really important piece to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember watching an interview where they were trying to figure out what the point was. And I think it was Sy Hersh that said that the United States wanted to attack Iran, mostly Dick Cheney, Bush too, but Dick Cheney really wanted to attack Iran. Israel knew that if there was an attack on Iran, then Hezbollah was likely going to attack them. And so this was like a preemptive strike to take out their ability and power to do so. What do you think about that? Do you think that that was what this was about? Or do you think it was about, trying to create like a perceived win in the war on terror that they were so obviously and evidently losing? Or what do you think? What was the purpose behind this 2006 attack?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all of that may have played a role because effectively the 2006 attack was, again, it was presented when Israel invaded Lebanon. It was presented as a response to the kidnapping of one of their soldiers over the border, but it was, of course, it had been planned in advance. It was a way. Obviously, this was six years after Hezbollah had liberated Lebanon from the Israeli occupation and had liberated the south. So this was, of course, a way to demonstrate visibility and presence by Israel. It was also a way to destroy evidence. I mean, one of the things that they did was that they did destroy some of the targets that they had previously held. I think there was a prison camp in particular that they had destroyed in 2006 that they had operated during the occupation, but of course also testing of techniques. So what they did in 2006 is they developed the so-called Dahiyeh doctrine. So Dahiyeh is a southern suburb of Beirut that has a high population density with mostly, I think the majority of the population are Shia Muslims. And what Israel did in 2006 was to really destroy a large part of this residential area and then try to what they called a disproportionate destruction, I think it was called. So this was what they then termed as the Dahiyeh doctrine. And then they used that in 2008 in the next war on Gaza. So in many ways, this war was a way of testing techniques. They were destroying the infrastructure, but they were also defeated. There were many battles that they completely lost. And effectively, I think that Hezbollah had claimed victory eventually because Israel was not successful in occupying Lebanon, but it did destroy a lot throughout those several weeks in the war. And to get back to your question regarding Iran, I definitely think that any of Israel's endeavors currently in the region ever since have this regional component in mind. It is always a way of extending their power, demonstrating strength, and which I also have failed in many ways. But just to give you another example, I mean, many of the times where Israel is invading Lebanese airspace, they are bombing Syria, right? So they're using Lebanese airspace to bomb Syria and then effectively claiming that they are destroying Iranian targets in order to defend themselves. So it oftentimes does have this regional component.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really important to talk about is Hezbollah's role both in the Lebanese civil war when it sort of came into formation and to where it is now, where it's effectively part of the Lebanese government and really the best defense that the Lebanese people have against Israeli incursions. And they're still designated as a terrorist group. They're still seen as a terrorist group in the West. But if you listen to Hassan Nasrallah talk, really in any sort of speech or whatever you want to call it that he's given, he seems very practical. And I know from what he said that if Hezbollah came to power in Lebanon, like they were the majority, they were the ruling party, they wouldn't call for Sharia law. They would ask or let the people decide what kind of social structure they wanted to live under. And there's a lot of misconception in the West about Hezbollah, and a lot of people don't even know who Nasrallah is. But from like 82 up until like 2006, because we want to talk about that massacre as well. But can you talk about the importance of Hezbollah and how they've um, gained traction in Lebanese politics, and they've become much more than just a militia or whatever you'd want to call them?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, if you ask, many people would tell you that Lebanon would not exist today if it wasn't for Hezbollah, and it had emerged as a resistance movement in the 1980s out of a context where in the south of Lebanon, where the south was, which had already been marginalized economically before the war, was under an illegal occupation by the Zionist regime. At the same time, there was a civil war that was taking place in Lebanon. So it was out of this context that the resistance emerged, and it effectively became strong enough to claim victory over this very well nuclear-armed First World Army that the Israeli army is. So in many ways, especially it was significant in the liberation of Lebanon in the year 2000, but also in defending Lebanon in 2006. And it was effectively the only force that was strong enough to defeat Israel. So in many ways, this of course has helped Hezbollah to become a regional actor and a very significant non-state actor. Now, of course, today it is a party in the parliament, but as you say, it's not just a militia; it is a socio political institution in Lebanon. It has helped in Lebanon's fight against terrorism, against ISIS. When they were at the borders of Lebanon, has effectively contributed and defended the country from foreign invasions, and it's acting as a deterrent against the Israeli regime. Because the question would really be, if there was no Hezbollah, would we actually, be able to be here at this point? But more than that, it is a political party that had the highest number of votes in the last parliamentary elections, and it is aligned with the party of the current president. So it does have political power since it is in the parliament, but also it does contribute to keeping a balance in the country because it's not keen on seizing the power, but actually to providing in a way the constitution that is in place. So, but as you say, there are many misconceptions about it in the West, particularly because it is such a Hezbollah poses maybe the most eminent danger to the Zionist regime, which is why, of course, it has been referred to as terrorist and has been designated by increasingly many countries, particularly in the last 1 or 2 years in Europe and beyond.
Yeah, I think the coverage in the West is obviously very misleading. I think something that is also not talked about is the fact that the United States has a direct hand in all of this. It's very easy to pass it off as, well, that's an Israel thing. But it's, in the 2006 one, Condoleezza Rice was set to visit, and they told her not to come because they were very clearly holding the United States accountable for this as well. Can you talk a little bit about the United States involvement and how intertwined the U.S. and Israel is in these ventures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's quite difficult to differentiate between the United States and Israel, partly because obviously the U.S. backs Israel. At the same time, the relations between the United States and Lebanon go back to a time before Israel has actually existed. But I think the Israeli, component has really negatively impacted the individual relations between the United States and other and countries in the region. But at the same time, I also think this is valid for most Western countries and European ones as well, because there is oftentimes this component of Israel's security that is prioritized, and it of course interferes with prosperity and peace in Lebanon and in Palestine. So it's incompatible to actually support the Zionist regime, but at the same time provide any support for stability or structure in any neighboring country. But at the same time, we see that there is obviously a US and European support for oppressive regimes farther east in this area, which are also now increasingly aligned with Israel, which also again proves the point that there is obviously a negative dynamic that is being sent towards whatever stands in the way of the settler colonial project.
Yeah, and right now we're seeing the UAE cozy up to Israel very much, and I mean there are obviously geopolitical advantages to that for the UAE, but I suspect there's something more nefarious behind it, but that remains to be seen. So let's fast forward to 2006 when Israel yet again hit the UN compound at Qana. But before we get into that, can we just provide a brief background of that war? Because I know you said earlier that from Israel's standpoint, it started when a soldier was kidnapped, but Noam Chomsky was very meticulous in pointing out that before that soldier was kidnapped, that Israel had kidnapped a Palestinian doctor and several other Palestinians. I can't remember if they were doctors as well, but it was one of those situations we see time and time again where Israel starts the clock for the narrative when it wants to, and it goes from there, especially in the mainstream media. So can you just talk about the origins of that war, and then we can get to what happened to the compound again?
Definitely, yeah. As you say, that was again the same narrative of Israel actually provoking reactions, which is what it does quite often. We had several situations also, I think, last summer and the year before, where Israel would start acting weird at the borders in order to provoke a reaction from Lebanon that then they could effectively present as if this was something that they are reacting to. So that was the same thing. I think that, yeah, Noam Chomsky has also written about that in a very lucid way and reconstructed this narrative. So then obviously 2006 and once it started, things escalated quite quickly. So it was this justification, but then like within a couple of days, the airport was bombed, the port. It was really, Israel was targeting the infrastructure, destroying bridges, highways to completely cut off the country. And that was, it was a very quick escalation. And so it obviously also from that seemed that it was, of course, very well prepared. And then the Qana massacre, the second one happened throughout that war. I think it was on July 31st, if I'm not mistaken.
July 30th, I think.
30th, okay, yeah. And that was, I think, also, I'm not remembering the numbers, but I think it was 28 people, if I'm not mistaken.
28 people, 15 children, I think.
Right,
It was two different families who were sheltering in the basement of an apartment building, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and even
there was talk at first once the official death toll came out, saying, well, this isn't enough to constitute a massacre, which I thought was atrocious, but yeah. Anyway,
that is
please.
a pretty vile response. Yeah.
Yeah. Continue.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, it was also again very similar to the 96 situation where Israel was, justifying that they were not aware of people being there, but they were intending to hit something else. And again, the whole question of why Israel was there in the first place was not addressed. And I think that the rhetoric that was used in 2006 was much more simple than the one before, because it was really just labeling everyone as terrorists, saying that people have missile factories in their homes and that's why they should die. And this was, something that you would also remember back then watching this interview on CNN with the CNN person asking one of the Israeli military spokespeople, who was just saying that Israel wants peace. Israel did not intend to kill this family, and that was
Mark Regev, probably.
maybe.
I'm not sure who it was, but
I think it was him back then. He's still around. He's still kicking around, but he's a very smooth talker, a very smooth propagandist.
I think they all are. And interestingly, it really, when you look at the language, it just really goes back to they are terrorists. We need to protect ourselves, and that's it. I mean,
And
but
they
just like real
they
life,
really
many
are good at
different
using
metaphors.
the human shield rhetoric as
Oh yeah.
well. They often like to use that against Hezbollah and say that, oh, they're using women and children as human shields, and we can't be blamed for that. And well, you can though. You really you really can. But that's become a really I know that they've been using that for a while, but it seems like that's been as time goes on, they use that more and more and more. The human shield excuse. Which is still a ridiculous excuse to kill children. But, I did also actually see a quote from, I think it was a IDF soldier who said that it's better that those children are dead. That's less terrorists to deal with later. And that really does just speak to the level of indoctrination and hatred that, they have in Israel. It's really unfortunate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's also,
go ahead.
Sorry. Go.
No, go
So
ahead.
I just want to add, like the thing that you just mentioned, also very genocidal in its core, right? Because it goes back to this idea of the demographic threat. So if they are alive, they are terrorists, which also goes back to the idea of settler colonialism. We have to eliminate them in order to be able to live. And I think these are very intertwined as narratives.
And it's very similar to pre-crime that we're seeing in the United States now, where you're seeing people being arrested for things that they've never done, but maybe have alluded to or mentioned on social media, and they're getting arrested for it. So it's, you're going to be a problem later, so we're going to deal with you now. And it's a little terrifying.
Yeah. And at the same time, Israel is claiming that it's using surgical precision to target the people it strikes. I mean, we've been hearing this since the 80s. If you go back and read the history of the Lebanese Civil War, that's when they started using that rhetoric, and they still use it and somehow still manage to hit civilian compounds or civilian buildings and kill people who aren't fighting in the war, and they get away with it. And that's part of the rhetoric. And it's eventually you have to ask yourself, well, if it's surgical precision, then they must mean to hit these places. But of course, they explain that away when they do hit a place like the Kana compound as, we made a mistake, and it's immediately forgiven. But
that's something else the United States is, it's the chicken before the egg. The United States says that stuff too now. Well, it's surgical precision. It's, they try to convince us that they don't kill civilians. And then, something like WikiLeaks comes out and we know that that's not true. And so, I mean, I think that's something that, again, the US and Israel are so intertwined. It's really difficult to tell them apart at some points.
Yeah. And, I think I don't want to say the 2006 war was worse than the Lebanese Civil War, because I just think that's a false comparison to make. But there was a lot of butchery during the 2006 war. I remember reading about mothers who were hit by artillery and had their unborn babies blown out of their stomachs. And still people in the US were saying, well, Israel has the right to defend itself, as if that's any form of self-defense.
No.
And we saw too that when Israel entered Lebanon on the ground, that they were pretty much handed their asses by Hezbollah. And then they do what they always do. They run away and they come back with airstrikes. And that's where we saw a lot of the casualties, I think. But beyond just being a proving ground for new weapons and possibly expanding their territory, do you think there was any other perhaps geopolitical message that Israel was trying to send, or was it just like, we can do this, so we're going to do it?
Mhm. Good question. I don't know. I mean, I do think that it was the geopolitical component and the territory, testing weapons, showing presence, but also probably maybe they were trying, maybe they were thinking that they would be able to defeat Hezbollah or to subjugate Lebanon under its control, under its sphere, or at least get it into a position where many other countries have been, where they have to capitulate or eventually normalize with Israel, or what they call peace. And obviously, Israel was not prepared for Hezbollah having developed or having reached such a level of sophistication that they can beat them. But I mean, yeah, of course, there might be other factors involved that I am not aware of or not considering at this point.
I think that Paul Jay from the Real News once speculated that it was because Bush and Cheney needed to manufacture a quote unquote win against the war on terror, because it was it was failing so miserably, and they needed something that they could be like, see, look, we're doing something where this is working, and they needed to justify the continuation of it. And this was supposed to be their win for that. So that's a potential. That was, again, just Paul Jay speculating. I watched an interview that he did a few years ago, kind of talking about the anniversary of it. But yeah, I think that that's definitely a possibility. I think that, they needed a reason to continue that war. I don't even know, war on an invisible, a non-tangible, whatever it is, which is weird all by itself. So I think that's definitely a possibility, that there could have been some of that involved too. I'm sure there were multiple different reasons. There were a lot of moving parts involved in that for sure. But I think that's definitely a good speculation on Paul Jay's part.
Yeah,
definitely. It makes sense, especially because Israel has also claimed victory in 2006, even though they had to, they effectively lost, but they did cause a lot of destruction. And then also the 2006 war has been used recently in this rhetoric of what I call war fantasies or genocidal fantasies that the Israeli regime has been extending towards Lebanon, with threatening to destroy Lebanon completely, to send it back to the Stone Age, to the Middle Ages, and so on. We've heard it from several politicians within the Israeli regime, and oftentimes referring to the 2006 war and saying what's going to happen will be so much worse, which is obviously propaganda in many ways, in order for them to demonstrate strength, but also shows that there is this frustration of them not having been able to defeat Lebanon in 73 years.
Yeah, and what's interesting too is that while Israel was saying they were hoping to set Lebanon's clock back 30 years, I think they said, at the same time, Condoleezza Rice in the US was saying these are the birth pangs of the new Middle East. So the contradiction there is obvious, but also the language is just grotesque in how clinical it is.
Well, and you also had the United States politicians using, all of their flowery language, we're really saddened by this loss of life. And where, they do all the propaganda and the platitudes that, let them skate by. But I think it's also, you brought up a really good point too, that they totally underestimated Hezbollah. They thought that they could go in there in like 4 or 5 days, it would be over with, and Hezbollah came ready to play. And they had been trained in like the anti-tank weaponry and stuff like that. So they were really underestimated at that time. So I think that was definitely a miscalculation on Israel's part, for sure.
Yeah, and if you can find it, it was once on the internet, but it seems to have disappeared. There's a really good essay by this scholar named Lara Deeb, and it's called Hezbollah Hitting Back, and it's about Hezbollah's strategy, basically hitting back against Israel during the 2006 war. And it provides a very good deconstruction of why it was legitimate and necessary. But funny enough, I haven't been able to find it for a while now. But she has another one out there too that also goes into the history of Hezbollah and gives a very good understanding of what the the group is and what their aims are, and really dispels a lot of the myths around them. But
There's a really good book. I'm forgetting the author's name, but I think it's called The Modern History of Lebanon. I think he's a professor or something. I don't know why I'm forgetting. It's on my bookshelf back there. But yeah, I think it's called The Modern History of Lebanon, that I definitely would recommend everybody check out. It's really good. It's really good.
yeah. And are you Lebanese yourself?
No, I'm not. I
Okay.
do live here. I've spent many years here.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask what in your opinion is the reason that Lebanon has been such a geopolitical, I hate to use this cliche terminology, but hotspot for so many decades now?
Oh, good question. I think, Lebanon is very unique, but I guess every place is unique in its own way. Obviously, geographically, it's at a crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. It is right next to Palestine. It's a small space that had been under occupation and control by so many different forces throughout history. And of course, it's demographically a very diverse space. So, Lebanon is just 10,000 square kilometers of size, which is very tiny, but does have, of course, many different narratives, a very diverse demography, and also the political spectrum is quite rich for such a small country. The United States, for example, has two large parties. In the Lebanese parliament, there are I think currently more than 20 different political parties, and many of the political dynamics are related to actors abroad, which oftentimes puts Lebanon onto an international dimension that makes it get more attention. But then, of course, it's also in a region where there's Syria that has been faced with a war for a decade now. There's Palestine, and it has been a place where, as we talked about, the United States and Israel have also tried to partition, and not only them. It was under French colonial rule for 2 decades in the past century, which has also led to it being a very diverse society today. And I think all these factors play a role in why Lebanon is so important for many people outside of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember hearing about Lebanon, hearing about Beirut when I was a little kid and not understanding what was going on. I was born in '83. But ever since then, it seems like, it hasn't been constantly in the news, but it keeps coming back as this sort of, as Ronald Reagan said, with regard to the Iran-Iraq war, when there was the shipping container wars, and shipping containers were being bombed in the I believe it was the Persian Gulf. But anyway, he said it was a choke point, and I feel like that's sort of like what Lebanon has become in a sense in the Middle East, is like this choke point, or this this focus. And it seems like every few years something is set off there, or something happens. There was the assassination of it was Rafiq Hariri, I believe it was, right? In 2005, 2006. Yeah, and there have been bombings of politicians since then, and a lot of that it's speculated that Israel is behind that. So yeah, I just find it very interesting that, such a small country, but it's a very diverse country, both in terms of its people and its geography, has become sort of caught in these like superpower war game.
Crossfires, yeah. It's like it's a game. It's just a little piece on the board for them. That's all that it really matters. But to that point though, moving forward, and I don't ever like to ask people to make predictions or anything like that, but what do you see for Lebanon and the region? Now that we have a Joe Biden presidency, it's very clear that he has no intention on stopping American imperialism. So what do you see moving forward for Lebanon? Do you think it's going to get worse for them? You don't have to make any predictions, just do you have any kind of thoughts or ideas about what direction you might see this headed?
That's a good question. I mean, besides everything that's been going on recently, and especially with the explosion that happened in August, which was another tragedy, and then there is an economic crisis currently in Lebanon, hyperinflation, which has affected people's daily lives beyond anything regarding politics or invasions. So there are many different, I feel, levels of struggles on so many levels many people have to go through currently. But I also do think that many people are still hopeful, and things could have even been worse at this point. So I think when it comes to, there are many challenges. Obviously, there's a political crisis, that there hasn't been a government for a while. There's economic crisis. There's the pandemic, of course. There is the inflation, the currency crisis, and so on. So it's difficult to predict, but I do think that Lebanon has been through various challenges in its history, and it was oftentimes the people who have rebuilt it. Now, I'm saying this without wanting to romanticize it, but there is at the same time potential, and depending on how things develop politically, internally as well as in the region, people, I don't know, I'm hopeful that there would effectively be a better situation in the end. But at the same time, I would also like to reiterate that I think as long as there is a Zionist regime in its current forms, there cannot be peace or safety for anyone in this region.
Right.
I think that's a fair statement.
I agree. So then getting into Palestine quickly, we keep hearing about the two-state solution. It's still put forward as this viable way to fix what's been going on
ridiculous.
for 70 plus years. So obvious question, what's your stance on the two-state solution that we keep hearing put forward?
I think the two-state solution, interestingly, is something that is not even pursued by Israel that much. It's much more part of rhetoric that we would hear from the US government, from the German government, from the European Union. And pretty much it is a void concept, but then also maybe from a more radical perspective, it's a way to perpetuate genocide and then keep the victims silent, because Israel obviously is not interested in a two-state solution. The UN resolution in 1947 envisioned a partition of Palestine in two states. And I mean, Israel was built on the idea that that should not exist. So there cannot be a two-state solution between a settler colonial movement that is trying to kill the indigenous people. At the same time, it is used in that rhetoric, but also I think for many Palestinians, it has been a one-state solution effectively for many decades, because they live under Israeli military rule. They are ruled by Israeli politicians without having access to citizenship, to human rights, to any sort of rights, which is what makes it an apartheid regime, very obviously. At the same time, I also know, I mean, oftentimes the two-state solution is mentioned in the same context of the so-called negotiations, right? They should go back to the negotiation table, and all of these sentences that have been repeated for maybe 3 decades now. None of that is actually there. Israel keeps on killing Palestine and Palestinians on a daily basis, and it's quite I don't know, fascinating that this narrative has been alive for so long, even though it has been declared dead by Israel itself. I mean,
Yeah, and if you look at a map of the West Bank and where all the Jewish colonies are, there's no possible way that that could be made into a contiguous state, as they like to say, anymore. And Gaza is effectively an open air prison, as we've heard
yeah.
many times, a ghetto. So it's really disheartening here in the U.S. to hear politicians still resort to that and say that, well, this is the answer, the two-state solution, as the UN declared in resolution, I think it's 242.
Sure.
I don't know.
I can't remember the number. But that was the resolution that essentially declared that the pre-1967 borders should be returned as such. But now we saw the Great March of Return, right? And everybody that had been asking up until then, like, where's like the Palestinian Gandhi? Like, where's the peaceful protest, as if like throwing rocks at a tank is, really violent. And then these marches happened, and we saw what happened to the people who participated. Just horrendous. And the Israelis claiming that, we're not shooting at them, they're walking into bullets, as if, that's physically possible.
And we once again saw the ability of Israel to create a narrative. I mean, they are very good at getting ahead of the situation, getting ahead of the story, and creating reality for their benefit. They did it. I always forget her name. Help me, Jesse. The medic that they shot.
Razan al-Najjar.
Thank you. I always forget her name. But yeah, they did it with her. They released this doctored video of her, like, supposedly claiming that she was being a human shield. And then it came out that that was like a completely manufactured, untrue video. And that's exactly what they do. That really does just bring it back to the fact that Israel's very talented at controlling the narrative. And we mentioned the rhetoric of the two-party or the two-state solution. And that's just, it's so obvious that that's just a platitude to convince people that we have good intentions and that we're trying to do what's best for everybody, because it sounds friendly, right? Like, come on guys, we can all do this together. And there is no together. It's Israel with their boot on Palestinians' necks, and the United States is very much helping put the pressure down. So I think it just really, it really does just tie back into the same, it's the same MO. This is the same playbook that they used and they have been using for decades. The United States and Israel, this is what they do.
Yeah. And we're seeing them, we've seen them now unilaterally, well, maybe not unilaterally because the US is involved, but move the embassy to Jerusalem. And then we've seen the illegal annexation and declaration of the Golan Heights as
Trump Heights,
as Israeli. Yeah. And I think a lot of this relates to Lebanon and the conquests they've tried to pursue there. And it hasn't worked because, as we've talked about, Hezbollah has been a very effective deterrent to their attacks. But yeah, we're definitely seeing it in Syria. We're seeing it in Iraq. We're seeing it in Yemen, Libya. I mean, Israel has its fingers in all of these places. So
for sure.
But again, it just seems like Lebanon is this, I don't know, maybe because it's more westernized than the other countries I mentioned. But yeah, it really seems kind of at the center of essentially what's been happening in the Middle East for decades now. So I think that's why we need to focus on it. But I don't want to keep you too long, but just to touch on the 2006 massacre. I want to note again that this compound was clearly marked on Israeli maps as a UN compound where civilians were taking shelter. And maybe you can talk about that a little bit. And then also, I'd just like to hit on um, the landmines that Israel's placed in southern Lebanon. And
Mhm.
apparently they have maps as to where all the mines are placed, but they refuse to hand them over to the Lebanese government or military. So there's this huge sort of danger zone, in the context of like is Israel's legacy in trying to conquer Lebanon. Maybe you can talk about that too.
Mhm. So, yeah, I wasn't aware of that they have a map of the mines, but definitely, I mean, everything Israel ever left in Lebanon was death and destruction. But also, I feel with the intention of returning and coming back, and I think that this was quite visible in 2006. But I just wanted to add another point before I forgot to something you mentioned before. When we to just answer the question also why Lebanon is so significant in this whole within these dynamics, I also think it's quite important to know that, at least in my analysis, as I see it, the liberation of Lebanon cannot be divided from the liberation of Palestine. And I think that's how Lebanon is tied to Palestine through also this shared history and the shared culture to some extent that makes it a target prosthetically in many ways. So that also, of course, plays a role in the Israeli approach towards Lebanon. But yeah, so that was what was I going to say about the massacre? Sorry, remind me.
What did you ask?
I just asked if I just to outline it a little bit what happened, because as in 96 it was a marked UN compound, and for almost 10 years later, a little over 10 years later, for it to be hit again, I mean, for that to be a mistake just sounds preposterous. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to that, and is it just Israel's intention to create terror? Because we know they don't care about civilians.
I do think it is their intention to create terror, and they do come to the same places time and time again. Just I think it was in August last year. So there's several things that happen repeatedly that don't really make headlines. One of the things is, of course, there are fighter jets over South Lebanon, over Beirut, sometimes over other areas. But also what they do sometimes is to the sonic bombs. I think that you mentioned it before, but also those flare bombs that they throw over the border. And then they would throw them at this village that they had already burned down in 1948. So they would still throw flare bombs at that village today because it's just at the border. So there is this very, I mean, disgusting, I would say, practice of returning to the same spots and hitting more and prolonging this also trauma that they're causing. And I think, obviously, Beirut itself is an example with so many places in Beirut being hit repeatedly throughout the time. So I think, Kana obviously might have been by intention twice the same compound also to demonstrate. But yeah, I don't think it's anything other than terror, and I don't think that they really care what they do because they know they will get away with it. And I mean, and that's the sad part, because I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Judith Butler who wrote a very interesting text on the creation of victimhood, where she also claimed that oftentimes people live in zones where they are not regarded as victims. So them getting killed is not an actual loss of life. We look at from the settler colonial perspective. So in many ways, these 28 people who were killed in 2006 or the over 100 in 1996 haven't been regarded as human in the first place. So the loss of their lives isn't really a loss. I think this is also something that underlines the structure of this Israeli, what we should really call terrorism. I mean, I don't have another word that
I think that's the only word that
Yeah.
qualifies. It really is. Israel is a
Terrorism.
terrorist nation. I mean, that their government anyway. I don't mean to say the people themselves. But I think that you're right. I think that it is very intentional that it is a repetition of the same sites. I think it creates kind of almost like a generational trauma, where it's each generation experiences their own event. Some of them multiple events. And I think that that's definitely intentional. It's a way of beating down a population. And like, I think you used a great word. Disgusting is a great word. It really is.
Yeah. Especially what we saw in 2006. I remember, for me, that was sort of my jumping off point for getting into geopolitics, and especially what's happened and what's happening in the Middle East. It was atrocious to watch on TV every day. And one of the interesting things is that back then, CNN still had correspondents on the ground who were reporting from Lebanon. Ben Wiedemann comes to mind, and Michael Ware. I think he was in Iraq, but anyway, they had people on the ground reporting, and that's totally gone now. If something were to happen in Lebanon now, we'd get like Anderson Cooper standing on a hill in Jerusalem telling us about what happened, So, maybe before we wrap up, can you speak to the media aspect of all of this?
Oh, definitely. This is an issue that I also keep on seeing and observing on a daily basis. I wonder, and it's something I actually asked in an article that I wrote a couple of months ago. I think the daily violations of the airspace are a great example of how invisible some of these things are to the media. Now, so if you haven't been to Beirut, Beirut is a place that's very accessible to Westerners, to Western audiences. So it's a multilingual city, particularly in the very urbanized areas in the center of the city. Most people will speak Arabic, English, and oftentimes French. So for someone who doesn't speak a word of Arabic, Lebanon is still very accessible. People can get through everything without needing Arabic. Or in fact, I mean, there are Lebanese people whose Arabic isn't great. So it's not that this is a place that's very remote or difficult to go to. Most Western citizens don't need a visa. And in fact, this is why under normal, quote unquote, normal circumstances, when there's no pandemic and economic crisis, Beirut used to be packed with people from the West who would either study the language here, do some foreign exchange, and of course, a lot of journalists, reporters, freelancers, or people who want to step into the Middle East and then use Beirut as a starting point. So I don't know about how many journalists there are per inhabitant, but there are many. And I often wonder, certain events like the airspace violations aren't really covered to a large extent in Western media. But beyond that, if we look at things that were taking place recently, oftentimes there is and now I don't want to generalize because I think this is a very complex subject, but if we talk about, let's say, the explosion that took place in August, or when the prime minister resigned, or the protests that erupted in October 2019, oftentimes what I would see in some certain Western media outlets would be the same words used to cover any of these events as if there was no difference, right? And then oftentimes it's, oh, this Middle Eastern nation has been in trouble for so long. How are the people going to, so it's always as if there's a copy pasting. And then also, of course, depending on who is writing what for what audience, it is oftentimes quite misleading. I remember when the protests started in 2019, there were 3 op-eds, I think, in the New York Times just right after the beginning of the protests, and just one of them really portraying the protests as if they were as if it was an anti-Iranian uprising. So oftentimes, people who are not even here, not on the ground, would write something and might think, okay, they can just get away with copy pasting something that they wrote about any other Middle Eastern place years ago. So there's no nuance, and there's a lot missing: historical components, political components, and I don't want to generalize, but I think it's a tendency that we can see in much of English language media. It just makes it also difficult for people to understand what's happening here if they don't see it with their own eyes, and that's quite dangerous as well.
Right. And I don't think people have a good idea of how differentiated the Lebanese population is, especially in terms of religion. I mean, you have Muslims, you have Christians, you have Maronites, and it's all across the map. And also, a lot of people don't know that Lebanon is essentially an imperial creation, something that was carved out by Western powers, even though it's its own country and has its own history and its own people. And I think that's part of what underlies why we keep seeing it at the center of conflicts that other powers are trying to start. So yeah, it's definitely an area to keep an eye on, especially as pertains Israel. And you can never predict what they're going to do. But I think that Hezbollah has gained a lot of traction, and there's certainly more of a defense than the Lebanese military. So, and I think Israel's afraid of them, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the future. So yeah, just before we wrap, I mean, how do you personally feel about?
Sorry, I'm laughing. He does this all the time. He already said just before we wrap, and then he's doing it again. Just before we wrap, he's got one more question. He does this all the time.
Personally, how do you feel? I'm not sure how long you've lived there, but just in general, are you optimistic? Are you unsure? I just like to get a feel for somebody who's lived there, what they're thinking about the future.
I think I am optimistic. It's difficult to stay optimistic most of the time, I guess, but definitely I think that's the only way forward. And because at the end, it also, I think, goes back to what one envisions as a possible future for themselves, and what kind of ideology one believes. And I think that there is a resistance within Lebanon against all these negative things that are happening. And I am definitely optimistic. I do try to stay optimistic as much as possible. And it's not always easy, but I think that's what we have to do somehow.
Yeah. You have to keep a little bit of hope. Otherwise, it's very easy to just give up, for sure. I definitely agree with that. We'd love to have you back on, as things develop and as things change, because I mean, things in the region are ever changing all day long, every day. So yeah, we would definitely love to have you back on to talk about things further in detail. I appreciate you taking so much time with us to talk today. It was definitely educational. I hopefully the audience will get something out of this, because as we mentioned several times already, this really does not get talked about enough in Western media. So I think having these conversations is definitely something that needs to happen more often. So I definitely appreciate you coming on the show. Do you want to tell everybody where they can find you, where they can follow your work on Twitter, if you have a website or whatever? That way people can kind of keep up with what you're covering there.
Sure. So thank you, first of all. It was great to be on your show. And yeah, they can find me on Twitter. So it's at DENIJEG. Or I do have a website, which is just myname.com in one word. Yeah.
Cool. We
Okay.
can link to all that stuff in the show notes too to make it easier for everybody to find you. So yeah, definitely.
All right.
So
So
much.
our guest today has been Dr. Daniel Jegic. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Almost. It's Yegic, but it's fine. I
Jegic.
react to all mispronunciation. So
What is the provenance of that last name?
Tom.
Jegic. What kind of
Mhm.
name is that?
Oh, it's originally a name from the former Yugoslavia.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just curious. My father's Ukrainian, so
Mhm.
anytime I see a possibly Slavic name, I'm
Yeah.
interested. So
Okay. Yeah.
um, yeah, Daniel Jegic, thank you very much for being our guest today
Thank you.
and breaking down what's happening in Lebanon, because a lot of people aren't covering it, and you have your finger on the pulse, and um, what you've been writing about, what you've been covering is extremely important to not just Lebanon but the West, because we have a huge footprint there. So we really appreciate your work, and as Misty said, we'd love to have you back on as things develop. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll link to your work in our show notes.
And
Thank you
thanks
so much.
everybody
I
for
really
watching.
appreciate it a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you, everybody.
definitely.
Thank
And
you for
thanks everybody for watching. Check out all of his work, and we'll have him back on later so that we can get updates and stuff. And yeah, we'll catch you guys next time.
take care.